She walked into that building as a new employee. She walked out hiding bruises on her wrist and carrying a secret that would bring a $1 billion empire to its knees. What Celeste Hawthorne didn't know was that the signature she'd been forging for years belonged to the one man who could legally shut her entire empire down. If you're new here, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Because the stories on this channel don't just shock you, they stay with you. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? Let's see how far this story travels. The parking lot at Titan Axis Corporation smelled like fresh asphalt and ambition. The kind of place that had been expanded 3 times in 6 years because the money kept coming faster than anyone knew where to put it. The main campus sat on 40 acres outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, a sprawl of glass and steel that caught the morning sun in a way the architects had clearly planned, because nothing about Titan Axis happened by accident. Or so the company liked to say. Natalie Brooks pulled into the visitors section at 7:43 in the morning, even though her badge didn't activate until 8. She sat in her car for a minute with the engine off, looking at the entrance. The lobby doors were tinted dark bronze. 2 security guards stood just inside. A woman in a charcoal blazer was already crossing the lot with the kind of walk that said she hadn't slept more than 5 hours and didn't need anyone to notice. Natalie had been a contract attorney for 11 years. She'd worked for smaller firms, mid-size firms, one disastrous stretch at a boutique litigation group in Charlotte that had nearly ended her career before she turned 34. She knew how to read a building. She knew what it looked like when a company was holding something together with pressure and ceremony. She grabbed her bag off the passenger seat and got out of the car. The position was junior legal compliance, a step down in title from what she'd had 2 years ago, but the pay was better and the benefits were real, and she and Elias had agreed that stable was more important than prestigious right now. Elias had said that. She'd agreed. She still wasn't entirely sure she believed it. Inside, the lobby was the kind of space designed to make you feel small on purpose. High ceilings. The company logo rendered in brushed aluminum on the far wall, backlit in pale gold. A reception desk staffed by a young man who smiled with his whole face and printed her temporary badge without looking at the computer screen, which meant he'd done it a few hundred times. "First day?" he said. "That obvious?" "You're looking at the ceiling. New people always look at the ceiling." She took her badge and clipped it to her lapel. "Does it get less impressive?" He considered that for a moment. "The ceiling? No, but you stop noticing it." Yeah. Her direct supervisor was a man named Gerald Fitch, mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of careful voice that suggested he chose words the way some people chose safe investments. He met her at the elevator on the 3rd floor and walked her through the compliance wing, pointing out the coffee station, the copy room, the shared drive structure, the protocol for flagging contract irregularities. "We run a tight ship here," he said. "Ms. Hawthorne expects documentation on everything. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen." "I've worked in compliance before," Natalie said. "I know the drill." Fitch nodded, but something in his face didn't quite settle. "Good. Then you'll fit right in." Her office was a windowed cubicle in the back corner of the department. Not bad for a first assignment, better than she'd expected. She spent the morning going through onboarding materials, setting up her email, reading through the compliance handbook, which was 67 pages, and had clearly been written by a committee that didn't entirely trust each other. Around 11, a woman named Dana Cho appeared in her doorway. Dana was the other junior compliance attorney, a year ahead of Natalie in tenure, and she had the look of someone who had decided to be relentlessly practical about everything. "Welcome to the 3rd floor," Dana said. "Fair warning, the printer on the left jams if you're printing anything over 40 pages. Use the one by the window." "Good to know." "Also, the coffee machine makes a noise at exactly 2:30 every afternoon that sounds like it's dying. It's not dying, it's just the heating element cycling. I thought someone was hurt the first time I heard it." "How long have you been here?" 14 months. Dana leaned against the doorframe. "You came from private practice?" "Before that, yeah. I was at a firm in Charlotte. Then I went independent for a couple years." Natalie paused. "It didn't take." Dana nodded like she understood without needing details. "Well, this place is stable, if nothing else." She said it in a tone that implied stability had a price, but she wasn't ready to name it yet. At 2 in the afternoon, Natalie received a calendar invite from the executive suite. No subject line, no body text, just a time, 3:15, and a room number on the 7th floor. She asked Dana about it. Dana went quiet in a way that was different from her usual quietness. The 7th floor, Dana said carefully, is Ms. Hawthorne's territory. I know who's on the 7th floor. Why would she want to meet with a junior compliance attorney on her first day? Dana looked at the invite on Natalie's screen, then looked away. I don't know, but I'd go. The elevator to the 7th floor required a different badge authorization, which meant someone had already added her access. That detail bothered her in a way she couldn't articulate during the 40-second ride up. The doors opened onto a corridor that was noticeably quieter than the floors below. Thicker carpet, recessed lighting, the faint smell of something like cedar. An assistant led her to a conference room at the end of the hall. Large windows, a long table with 8 chairs, all empty. A credenza along one wall with a crystal water pitcher and glasses that looked like they'd never been used. Natalie sat down and waited. Celeste Hawthorne came in at 3:22, which Natalie suspected was intentional. She was 51, sharp-boned, with silver-threaded hair she wore pulled back in a way that looked effortless and wasn't. She had on a dark navy suit and no jewelry except a watch that probably cost more than Natalie's car. She didn't apologize for being late. She sat down across the table, set a folder in front of her, and looked at Natalie for a moment without speaking. Natalie Brooks, she said finally, you went to Wake Forest for law school. I did. Your husband is Elias Brooks. Something shifted in Natalie's chest, a small and careful tightening. Yes. I knew of him, years ago. Celeste opened the folder but didn't look at it. You understand that your employment here has nothing to do with him. I understand that. Good. Because I need people in compliance who are loyal to this company's interests, not to outside parties, not to family connections. She paused. Do you understand the distinction I'm making? Ms. Hawthorne, I'm a licensed attorney. My professional obligations are well defined. I don't need a primer. Something flickered across Celeste's face. Not quite irritation, but close. She closed the folder and stood up, which was meant to signal the meeting was over. Natalie stood too. I wanted to meet you personally, Celeste said. I do that with all new compliance staff. This company operates at a scale that doesn't leave room for misunderstandings. I appreciate that. Celeste moved toward the door, then paused near the credenza. She opened the side drawer, and for a reason Natalie didn't understand yet, she reached past the drawer and lifted a hanging file from a rack on the credenza's shelf. The file was thick, rubber-banded, the kind of document bundle that gets assembled in stages. Natalie's eyes went to it automatically, the way a lawyer's eyes go to documents. The tab was facing outward. She read 2 words before Celeste shifted and blocked her sight line. Brooks Licensing. That'll be all, Ms. Brooks, Celeste said. Tut. She didn't say anything to Dana when she got back to the 3rd floor. She sat at her desk and pulled up the company's internal contract archive, which junior compliance staff had read access to. She typed in search terms, careful terms, the kind that wouldn't look strange in an access log. At 4:47 p.m., she found the first document. It was a licensing agreement dated 9 years ago between Titan Access Corporation and an independent engineering consultant. The consultant's name had been redacted in the copy she was accessing, but the agreement number matched a series she recognized from the onboarding materials. Core System Licensing, the kind of contract that sat at the foundation of the company's proprietary warehouse management infrastructure, the technology that made Titan Access's distribution network faster and more accurate than any of its competitors. She looked at the signature line. The signature was scrawling, slightly right-tilted, with a specific way of looping the lowercase l in the last name. She had watched that signature go onto birthday cards, lease agreements, a mortgage application, and approximately 400 takeout receipts over the course of 8 years of marriage. That was Elias's signature. Her mouth went dry. She printed the document quietly, using the printer by the window, not the one that jammed, and slid it into her bag without looking at it again. She closed the archive. She looked at her screen for a moment, then looked at the time. 4:53. She had 7 minutes until the end of the standard workday. She spent them staring at a vendor compliance checklist she couldn't focus on. Indeed. She was almost to the elevator when she heard her name, not from down the hall. From behind her, from the alcove near the emergency stairwell, a door that opened before she reached it. Celeste Hawthorne's assistant, a young man named Philip, who Natalie had seen twice and hadn't spoken to, stepped out. He looked uncomfortable in a specific way, the way people look when they've been asked to do something they know is wrong but haven't figured out how to refuse. "Ms. Hawthorne would like a word," he said. "I was just leaving." "She knows. She'd just like a quick word." The stairwell was dim and concrete-smelling, a contrast to the carpeted hush of the executive floor. Natalie followed him up half a flight to a landing between floors, the kind of non-space that buildings have and nobody uses. Celeste was already there, standing against the wall with her arms folded. She looked different in the stairwell light, not softer, just less composed. "The document you printed at 4:49, Celeste said. Natalie kept her expression level. "I have read access to the compliance archive. I was reviewing a licensing agreement as part of my onboarding." "That's not what you were doing." "I'm not sure what else you'd call it." Celeste moved forward. Just a step, just enough to close the distance in a way that wasn't accidental. "You're going to give me what you printed." "I don't have anything to give you." "Natalie." Celeste's voice dropped and something in it changed, went quieter and colder in the same breath. "You don't understand what you're looking at, and the smartest thing you can do right now is walk away from it." "I just want to get to my car." "Then give me the document." "I don't have a document." What happened next was fast enough that Natalie's brain registered it in pieces rather than as a continuous event. Celeste's hand closed around her left wrist, not a grab, something more deliberate than a grab, with a specific pressure and angle that said this had happened before, that she knew how to do it. Natalie twisted instinctively, and the pressure increased before it released, and then Celeste stepped back, and her expression closed like a shutter coming down. "I'll see you tomorrow," Celeste said. Philip was looking at the wall. Natalie walked down the stairs, through the lobby, across the parking lot, and got into her car. She put her hands on the steering wheel. She looked at the bronze-tinted doors. Her wrist hurt in a dull, specific way that would be purple by morning. She reached into her bag without looking and felt the folded document with her fingertips. Still there. She started the car and drove home. Elias was in the kitchen when she got back, standing at the stove with a dish towel over his shoulder, doing something with pasta that involved more steps than pasta usually required. He was like that. Couldn't do anything the simple way, not because he was showing off, but because his brain defaulted to optimization, and sometimes optimization meant 4 extra steps and better results. He turned when she came in, and his face did the thing it always did when he was about to say something about dinner timing, and then he stopped. "What happened to your face?" "Nothing happened to my face." "Nat, you look like—" "I'm fine." She set her bag on the counter. "The day was long. Can we eat first?" He studied her for a moment in that quiet way he had, the way that sometimes felt like being read. Then he turned back to the stove. 10 minutes, he said. She went upstairs and took off her jacket and looked at her wrist in the bathroom mirror. It was worse than she'd thought. A deep flush of red and purple along the inside of the joint, the kind of bruise that would spread by morning. She held it under cold water for a minute, then rolled her sleeve down. When she came back downstairs, Elias had the food on the table and was sitting with his reading glasses on, looking at something on his phone. He took his glasses off when she sat down. They ate without talking for a little while. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. They'd been married long enough that silence had different textures, and this one was the kind where both of them were thinking and neither one was ready to start. Finally, she said, "I need to show you something." She got the document from her bag and unfolded it on the table between them. Elias looked at it. His fork went still. He picked it up and read it slowly, which wasn't the way he usually read. He usually skimmed, processed fast, moved on. This was careful and deliberate, and the color in his face changed by degrees. "Where did you get this?" His voice was flat in a way she hadn't heard in a long time. "The compliance archive. Elias, this is my signature." He set the document down. "This is my signature on a document I never signed." "I know." He looked at her. Then he looked at her wrist. The sleeve had shifted when she reached across the table, and the edge of the bruise was visible. "Natalie." "It's fine." "Who did that?" She held his gaze. "The CEO, Celeste Hawthorne." A pause. "She wanted the document back. I didn't give it to her." Elias sat very still for a moment. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. "How many agreements are in that archive?" he said. "I don't know yet. I only found one. But there could be more." "Elias, there are almost certainly more." He picked up his fork and set it back down without eating. He took off his glasses and folded them and placed them on the table beside his plate with the careful precision of someone who needed to do something with their hands. "I created that system," he said. "In 2014 and 2015, I was a contractor. I had a licensing agreement, a real one I actually signed, that gave them operational rights under specific conditions." He paused. "There was a clause. I put it there myself because my attorney told me to. An emergency licensing clause that let me revoke operational access if I could prove the system was being used to facilitate documented fraud or safety violations." Natalie looked at him. "Do you still have that agreement?" "Somewhere." He looked across the kitchen toward the hall that led to his office. "I never threw anything away." She folded the document carefully and set it between them. "Then we need to find it," she said. Elias nodded once. He looked at her wrist again, and something in his expression went through a change she recognized. Not anger exactly, but the thing that lives underneath it, the slow and settling kind that doesn't make noise. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We do." Elias found the original licensing agreement at 11:47 that night, buried inside a manila envelope at the back of the third drawer of a filing cabinet he hadn't opened in 4 years. The cabinet itself was wedged between a broken treadmill and a shelf of engineering textbooks in the spare bedroom he'd converted into an office when they bought the house. The room smelled like old paper and the particular staleness of spaces that get used but never quite lived in. He stood at the cabinet with the envelope in his hands for a moment before he brought it out to the kitchen table where Natalie was waiting with a second cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She watched him open it. He pulled out a document that was 31 pages long, paper-clipped at the top corner, the pages slightly yellowed at the edges. He set it flat on the table and turned to the last page. His signature was there. The real one. Same right-leaning tilt, same looped L, but with something the forged version didn't have. A small ink smear just below the final stroke of the S, where he dragged his hand slightly before lifting the pen. He'd always done that. An unconscious thing. He pointed to it without speaking. Natalie leaned in close. Then she got up and retrieved the printed document from her bag and set it beside the original. She looked at both signatures for a long time. "The smear," she said. "I've signed my name the same way since I was 19. That smear shows up on almost everything I've ever signed. It's not on their version. They copied the shape, but not the habit." "Right." She straightened up. "Elias, if they forged your signature on the agreement in the archive, they might have forged it on others. Amended agreements, addendums, waivers." She paused. Waivers that would have given up rights the original contract was designed to protect. He'd already been thinking that. He'd been thinking it since he sat down to read the forged document, turning it over in his mind the way he turned over engineering problems, looking for the failure point, the place where the structure had been compromised. "The emergency clause," he said. "If they forged an amendment that purported to remove it, they'd have thought they were covered." "Do you have any other documents from that period? Correspondence, emails, drafts?" "I have everything." He looked toward the office. "I kept everything. I always kept everything. My old attorney told me to, and He stopped. "Her name is Margaret Osei. She's been in private practice in Durham for 20 years. She drew up the original agreement." "Is she still practicing?" "As of 3 years ago, yes. I ran into her at a conference." He looked at Natalie. "She'd have copies, attorney files. She'd have her own correspondence record." Natalie was quiet for a moment. She turned the original agreement to the clause section and read with her index finger moving under the lines, a habit from law school she'd never lost. When she reached the emergency licensing provision, she read it twice. "This is real," she said softly. "This is actually real, Elias. If corruption is documented and provable, you can trigger a controlled operational shutdown. You retained that right. They could have forged a waiver of it, but they couldn't actually remove it, not without your real signature on a valid amendment. And if they forged the amendment, then the original controls. The amendment is void." She set the document down. "But we need to know what else they forged, and we need to know what the forgeries were used to cover." He looked at her wrist. The bruise had darkened since dinner. She'd been careful not to use that hand reaching across the table, and he'd been careful not to say anything about it, because he knew her well enough to know that pointing at it again would make her close off. "I need to go back tomorrow," she said, before he could. "Nat, I know, but if I don't show up, it tells them something, and right now the one thing we have is that they don't know how much I've seen or what I've understood." She met his eyes. "I can handle one more day." He didn't say anything. That was the hardest thing he'd ever done in a marriage full of hard things. Sitting still when someone he loved walked toward something dangerous, because she was right, and walking toward it anyway. She was at her desk by 7:58 the next morning. Dana was already there, which was unusual. She looked up when Natalie came in and then looked back at her screen in a way that wasn't quite natural. "Morning," Natalie said. "Morning." A pause. "How are you feeling?" "Fine." "Why?" Dana looked up again. "Philip came by this morning, before 7. He was asking if I'd seen you yesterday afternoon, whether I knew when you left." Natalie set her bag down slowly. "What did you tell him?" "I said I didn't know. I said I left at 5 and didn't pay attention to anyone else." Dana's voice was careful, each word placed. "I also said I hadn't seen you print anything." Natalie looked at her. "Dana?" "I don't know what's happening," Dana said. "And I'm not asking, but I've been here 14 months and I know what it looks like when someone on the 7th floor starts asking questions about someone on the 3rd floor. She turned back to her screen. "Just be careful." The morning passed slowly. Natalie did what she was supposed to do, reviewed vendor compliance reports, flagged 2 minor inconsistencies in a supplier contract, attended a 40-minute department meeting where Gerald Fitch talked about quarterly documentation standards with the energy of a man who had stopped expecting anything to be interesting. She took notes. She asked one question, the right kind of question, the kind that said she was paying attention to the work and nothing else. At 11:30, she went to the bathroom on the 2nd floor instead of the 3rd and called Elias from a stall with the water running. "Margaret Osai," he said before she finished saying his name. "I reached her this morning. She has the full file. Original agreement, all correspondence, 3 draft versions, and a legal memo she wrote at the time about the licensing clause. She never destroyed any of it." "Did you tell her why you were asking?" "I told her I had reason to believe the agreement had been misrepresented. She didn't push for details. She just said she'd have everything ready." A pause. "Nat, she said something else. She said she was glad I called because she'd had a feeling years ago that something about the deal wasn't right. She said the licensing fee payment stopped about 18 months after the agreement was signed. She flagged it, but I told her to let it go." "You told her to let it go?" "We needed the money. We just bought the house. I figured—" He stopped. "I figured it was a billing dispute and it wasn't worth fighting over." His voice had something in it she didn't hear often. Not quite embarrassment, but the particular heaviness of a decision made for practical reasons that turned out to matter more than you knew. "I should have pushed." "You didn't know what you were dealing with." "No, I didn't." She turned off the water. "I need something else. I need to know what the system actually does. The Titan Axis warehouse management infrastructure. Not the marketing version, the actual engineering. What it controls, what shuts down if the licensing is revoked." "I built it, Nat. I know exactly what it does." "Then write it down. All of it. And I need you to be specific about the safety components, because when this goes to regulators, They're going to want to know that a shutdown won't hurt workers. It can't hurt anyone. It won't. The emergency clause specifically triggers a controlled safety shutdown. Everything goes to protected standby. Workers get evacuation time. No system just drops. He paused. That's why I built it in, because I knew someday someone might misuse the thing, and I didn't want anyone getting hurt when it was corrected. She exhaled. Okay, I'm going to make it to the end of the day, and then we need to sit down with everything. She made it to the end of the day. Barely. At 4:15, Gerald Fitch appeared in her doorway with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite succeeding. Ms. Hawthorne would like your access to the contract archive temporarily suspended while IT conducts a routine audit, he said. It's affecting several staff members. Shouldn't be more than a few days. Of course, Natalie said. Should I document the access gap for compliance purposes? Gerald blinked. I'll look into whether that's necessary. Standard practice is to document any interruption in compliance staff's access to core records. Just want to make sure we're covered. She smiled pleasantly. I'll draft a memo and copy you. Gerald left without answering. She spent the next 15 minutes drafting the memo, which she saved to her personal work folder and also emailed to her personal account before the access suspension took effect. Then she packed up and left. The meeting that night happened in Elias's office, which meant the three of them, Natalie, Elias, and Margaret Osei, who'd driven up from Durham with a document box in her trunk, were crammed around a desk that wasn't built for three people and a box full of paper. Margaret was 62, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She'd been practicing law since before Natalie went to college, and she had the specific kind of stillness that comes from having seen things go wrong in so many ways that nothing surprises you anymore. She spread the documents across the desk without ceremony. Original agreement, correspondence file, the legal memo. I charged Elias $4,800 to draw this up, she said, which was my standard rate at the time. He paid in 2 installments and apologized for it. She looked at Elias. You shouldn't have apologized. I remember. The licensing clause is on pages 19 through 22. I drafted it specifically because the technology was core infrastructure, the kind of thing that becomes load-bearing the moment a company builds their operations around it. I wanted him to have a real exit if the relationship went wrong. She tapped the page. What I'm hearing is that it went very wrong. Natalie set the printed document from the Titan Access archive beside the original. They have a version in their system with his signature. He never signed it. Margaret looked at both documents for about 30 seconds. She didn't say anything for a long moment. There's a smear, she said finally. On the real one, Elias said, not on theirs. I know. I watched you sign this. I remember the smear. She pulled her reading glasses up from the chain. What else is in their archive? I don't know yet. My access was suspended this afternoon. Conveniently, yes. Margaret put her glasses on and looked at the forged document more carefully. This is good work, actually, for a forgery. Someone put effort into it. The signature's close. She set it down. But close isn't the same as right, and we have the original with notarized date stamps from the filing. She looked at Natalie. You're thinking a forensic document examiner. I have someone in mind, a man named Robert Kane. He testified in a securities fraud case I worked on 4 years ago. He's thorough, and he'll hold up under cross-examination. Good. What else do we need? Natalie had written it out during her lunch break on a notepad she'd bought at the pharmacy 2 blocks from the office and kept in her coat pocket. She unfolded it now. We need the forensic analysis on the signature. We need Margaret's file and testimony as to the original agreement's authenticity. We need a financial trail. Payments that stopped, licensing fees that were never paid, or fees that were paid to an account that doesn't connect to Elias. And we need internal evidence of the safety violations. She paused. The outline I was told is that they've been hiding system defects. If the warehouse management system has documented faults that they knew about and concealed, that's both a regulatory issue and it goes directly to the emergency clause. You were told, Margaret said, noting the phrasing. Someone on the inside. I haven't confirmed everything yet. But you think it's real? I think a company that forges founding documents doesn't stop there. Margaret nodded slowly. She pulled a yellow legal pad from her bag, the old-fashioned kind, and uncapped a pen. Then let's make a list. The someone on the inside was named Victor Alade. Natalie had met him briefly at the compliance department meeting on her second day. A quiet man in his early 50s who worked in internal audit and sat in the back row and didn't volunteer anything. He had the careful inward quality of someone who'd spent years watching things and not speaking. She ran into him on purpose in the parking garage on her third morning, which required knowing what time he arrived, which she'd noted without appearing to note it. "Mr. Alade," she said, falling into step beside him. "Natalie Brooks. We met briefly Tuesday." "I remember." His voice was measured. "Junior compliance." "That's right." She kept her tone easy. "I had a question about the audit documentation format. I was told you might be the right person." He looked at her sideways. They were at the elevator now, and it was empty in the garage at this hour. He pressed the button, and they waited. "What kind of question?" he said. "The kind that isn't really about documentation format." He was quiet for a beat. "I see. I found something in the archive before my access was suspended. I think you might know what I'm referring to." She kept her voice low and even. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm asking if you'd be willing to have a conversation outside of this building." The elevator came. They got in. He pressed 3. She pressed 3. "There's a coffee shop on Glendale," he said, looking at the door. "Not near here. About 2 miles west. They open at 6. A pause. "I'm sometimes there on Thursday mornings." The elevator opened. They walked out in different directions. Thursday morning, 6:10, Victor Alade was already at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a newspaper he wasn't reading. Natalie sat across from him. Neither of them ordered anything immediately. "How long have you known?" she asked. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "That something was wrong? Since my second year. That it was this specific? About 8 months? What did you find?" "Maintenance logs," he said. "The warehouse management system, the WMS, has a diagnostics layer. It logs errors, system alerts, flagged anomalies. Every major distribution center generates these logs automatically, and they're supposed to be reviewed by the operations compliance team monthly." He looked at her. "Someone has been modifying the logs before they're archived, not deleting them. That would be too obvious. Changing severity codes. Turning critical alerts into routine notices. Burying them. How do you know they've been changed? Because the raw diagnostic data is also stored in a separate engineering server, a server that the operations team apparently forgot existed or assumed was decommissioned. It wasn't. I found the access path by accident, doing an infrastructure audit 18 months ago." He paused. "The raw logs and the archived logs don't match. There are critical system defects in the raw data that don't appear anywhere in the official record." "What kind of defects?" "Load calibration errors. The system controls automated weight distribution in the warehouses, conveyor routing, pallet management, automated lift systems. If load calibration fails past a certain threshold, the automated lifts can receive incorrect weight data, which means they can be directed to carry loads they're not rated for." He said it quietly without drama, which somehow made it worse. "It's happened. 3 incidents in the last 2 years that I found in the raw logs. Workers were injured. The incidents were coded as operator error in the official reports." Natalie sat with that for a moment. "You have the raw logs?" "I copied them to an encrypted drive 8 months ago when I understood what I was looking at. I've been trying to figure out what to do with them." He looked down at his coffee. "I have a daughter starting college next year. I have a mortgage. I've been sitting on this." She didn't judge him for that. She didn't say anything about it. "If I told you there was a legal mechanism that might allow this to be addressed without the first move coming from you," she said carefully, "would you be willing to provide documentation to support it after the process was already in motion?" He was quiet for a long time. The coffee shop was filling up around them, the noise of other people's mornings rising and covering the silence at their table. "Who else is involved?" he said finally. My husband. His original attorney. A forensic document examiner. She paused. Potentially a financial investigator, depending on what's in the records. What's your husband's connection to Titan Axis? He built the system, she said. The whole warehouse management infrastructure. They've been using it for 9 years under forged licensing agreements. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, but the particular look of someone who has been carrying something alone and has just been told they don't have to anymore, which is different from relief because it also involves a reckoning with how long you carried it. The encrypted drive, he said. I have it at home. Keep it there for now, keep it exactly where it is. She leaned forward slightly. And if anyone asks what we talked about this morning, documentation format, he said. You had a question about documentation format. She nodded. She finally picked up the coffee menu because sitting at a table without ordering anything was something people remembered. The financial investigator came through Margaret Osei, who had a professional network that stretched back 3 decades and apparently included everyone who was anyone in white-collar litigation support in the state of North Carolina. Her name was Priya Sandhu, and she worked freelance after 12 years at a regional accounting firm where she'd specialized in tracing money through corporate structures that didn't want to be traced. She and Natalie met at Margaret's office on a Saturday morning, while Elias was at home with the engineering documentation spread across the kitchen table. He'd been reconstructing the technical record for 3 days. What the system did, how it worked, what the licensing payments were supposed to be, what they would have totaled over 9 years if Titan Axis had been paying them. The number, when he finally calculated it, was $4.3 million in unpaid licensing fees based on the formula in the original agreement. He called Natalie when he got there. She didn't react on the phone because she was sitting across from Priya and Margaret, and she had learned over 11 years of legal work how to receive a large number without showing it on her face. We need to talk tonight, she said. Yeah, Elias said. We do. She could hear him at the kitchen table, surrounded by paper, and she thought about the way he'd looked the night they found the forged document. Not angry, but something slower and steadier than anger, something that had been building in him across the 3 days since without finding a place to land. He'd built something real. He'd built it carefully, with specific protections written in because he'd thought about what could go wrong and tried to prevent it, and someone had looked at that work, recognized its value, and decided it was easier to steal it than to pay for it. She thought about the workers in those warehouses. 3 incidents in 2 years. Injury reports coded as operator error. She thought about the bruise on her wrist, which had gone from purple to green at the edges, the way bruises do when they're healing but aren't healed yet. Tonight, she said, and hung up. Across the table, Priya was already drawing a diagram on a legal pad. Corporate entities, payment flows, the financial architecture of a company that had built its balance sheet on a foundation it didn't own. If the licensing fees were never properly paid, Priya said, the revenue that should have offset them was absorbed somewhere, either into operational accounts or redistributed to executive compensation. She tapped her pen on the pad. Companies that commit this kind of fraud usually don't just commit one kind. You find a forged signature, you look for inflated contracts. You find inflated contracts, you look for false expense claims. It tends to compound. How long would it take you to trace it? Margaret asked. Depends on what's public record and what we can get through formal channels once we have legal standing. Priya looked at Natalie. But if your husband has 9 years of documentation and I have access to Titan Axis's public filings, I can build a preliminary picture in about 10 days. Start with the public filings, Natalie said. 10 days. Priya nodded and wrote something on the pad. Margaret refilled her own coffee from the carafe on the side table. The morning light was coming through the blinds in long, thin strips across the floor. They worked until noon. Then Natalie drove home and Elias had made sandwiches he'd left on the counter, practical and slightly haphazard, the bread cut uneven, the mustard applied too generously on one side. She stood in the kitchen and ate one without sitting down. He came in from the office and stopped when he saw her face. How bad is it? He said. It's as bad as we thought. She set the sandwich down. But we have everything we need, we just have to hold it together long enough to use it right. He leaned against the counter and looked at the table, still covered in his documentation. Margaret's confident about the original agreement? She's more than confident. She remembers watching you sign it. Natalie looked at him. Elias, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight. Okay? When you trigger the emergency clause, when this actually happens, are you ready for what comes after? Because it's not just their company. It's your name on that system. It's your work. People are going to know everything about how it was built, what you were paid, what you weren't paid. She paused. It becomes public. He was quiet for a moment. I built something good, he said finally. I built it to work, and I built it with protections because I cared about whether it was safe. And for 9 years they used it and paid me nothing and told themselves they'd gotten away with it. He met her eyes. I don't care who knows about it. I want them to know about it. I want the whole thing out in the light. She held his gaze. Then she picked up her sandwich again and took a bite and looked out the window at the backyard where the grass needed cutting and neither of them had gotten to it. Okay, she said. Then we keep going. Priya Sandhu delivered her preliminary financial report on a Tuesday afternoon, 9 days after she said it would take 10. She drove to Margaret's office and spread 11 pages of printed analysis across the conference table without preamble, the way people do when the numbers speak clearly enough that introduction feels like stalling. Natalie sat across from her. Margaret stood at the end of the table with her reading glasses on. Elias sat beside Natalie with his arms folded and his jaw set in the way it got when he was processing something he hadn't let himself feel yet. The public filings alone tell most of the story, Priya said. She pointed to the first page, a timeline rendered in clean columns. Titan Axis reported licensing costs for the warehouse management system for the first 18 months after the original agreement. Small amounts, partial payments that align roughly with what the formula in Elias's contract would have generated at reduced scale. She moved her finger down. Then the line item disappears from their operational expense reports entirely. Starting in month 19, there is no record of any licensing payment in any filing, any disclosed vendor relationship, any subsidiary account that I can find. They just stopped, Natalie said. They stopped, and then they restructured how they categorized their technology costs so the gap wouldn't be visible. The WMS infrastructure gets folded into a broader proprietary systems line starting in their fiscal year 2016 annual report. Before that, it was itemized. After that, it's absorbed. Priya turned to the second page. Now here's where it gets more complicated. The technology is the backbone of their whole distribution model. 15 warehouse facilities across 7 states. Revenue attributed directly to the WMS operational advantage has grown every year for 9 years. Their competitive pricing model, their same-day fulfillment guarantee, their contract wins with major retail partners, all of it depends on this system working the way it does. Which means the value they've extracted from it, Elias said slowly, is significantly larger than $4.3 million in licensing fees. Much larger. I can't give you a precise number without forensic access to internal records, but a conservative estimate based on their reported margins and market positioning puts the total value extracted from the unlicensed use of your technology somewhere between $60 and $90 million over 9 years. The room went quiet. Elias looked at the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. Natalie watched him and didn't reach for his hand because she knew he needed a second, and she knew when touching him helped and when it didn't. There's more, Priya said, which was not a phrase anyone in that room wanted to hear, but all of them had been expecting. I cross-referenced executive compensation disclosures with the period where the licensing payments stopped. In the same fiscal year the payments disappear, Celeste Hawthorne receives a performance bonus of $2.1 million. The board resolution justifying the bonus cites, and I'm quoting directly here, exceptional cost reduction in core technology operations. Margaret took her glasses off. They paid her a bonus for stealing it. That's the implication, yes. Natalie had been taking notes. She stopped writing and looked at what she'd written, then set the pen down. Priya, can you testify to all of this? Everything I've shown you is derived from public filings. Yes. And once there's legal standing for discovery, once this moves into a formal proceeding, I can trace the internal accounts. I'd need access, but with the right filing, that access becomes compellable. We're not there yet, Natalie said. We need one more piece before we move. Everyone at the table knew what she meant. Victor Alade's encrypted drive, the raw diagnostic logs, the evidence that Titan Axis hadn't just stolen the technology. They'd concealed the consequences of mismanaging it, and workers had been hurt because of it. Without that, they had financial fraud and forgery. Real, serious, prosecutable. But with it, they had something that would make regulators move faster than any civil filing could. Something that would make the story impossible to contain or spin or manage. Natalie was still going into the office every morning. The second week was harder than the first. Her archive access was still suspended, which Gerald Fitch kept describing as temporary and ongoing in a way that contradicted itself. Dana had gone quiet in a different way than before. Not protective quiet, but careful quiet, the kind that meant she was being watched and knew it. Natalie didn't push her. She did her assigned work, flagged the things she was supposed to flag, attended the meetings she was supposed to attend, and spent her lunch hours either on calls with Margaret or walking around the block twice because sitting still had gotten difficult. On the 9th day, Philip appeared at her desk in the early afternoon. She'd been expecting it. She hadn't known when, but she'd been expecting it. "Ms. Hawthorne would like to see you," he said. He didn't add again, and neither did she. This time the meeting was in Celeste's actual office, not the conference room. It was a large space with the kind of minimal decoration that cost more than ornamentation would have. A single painting on the far wall that was probably significant, a desk that was either antique or built to look like it, windows that faced the campus, and the parking lot and the flat line of the North Carolina horizon beyond. Celeste was standing when Natalie came in. That was a choice, too. "Close the door," Celeste said. Natalie closed it and stood in front of the desk without sitting down, because Celeste hadn't invited her to sit, and she wasn't going to ask. "You've been busy," Celeste said. "I've been doing my job." "Outside of your job?" Natalie kept her face neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you are." Celeste moved around the desk and sat on its edge, a posture that was meant to feel casual and read as anything but. "Your husband's attorney, Margaret Osei, made 2 calls to our legal department this week, requesting records." Natalie hadn't known that. She kept that off her face. "Attorneys make records requests," she said. "It's fairly standard. Attorneys who represent parties with adverse interest to this company do not get to make records requests through informal channels while their client's spouse is employed here." Celeste's voice was measured, each word carrying its own weight. "You understand what I'm saying? I understand that you're suggesting a conflict of interest." "I'm not suggesting it. I'm naming it." "Then name it formally, and HR can evaluate it." Natalie met her eyes. "That's the process." Something moved in Celeste's expression, a flash of something that wasn't quite anger but was close to the frustration of someone who is used to conversations going the way she directs them and is encountering resistance she didn't plan for. "I gave you an opportunity," Celeste said. "Your first day. I told you this company doesn't leave room for misunderstandings." "You did. And you've spent 2 weeks creating exactly that." "Or," Natalie said carefully, "I've spent 2 weeks doing compliance work, which is what you hired me to do." She paused. "If you'd like to discuss specific concerns about my performance, I'm happy to do that with HR present." Celeste looked at her for a long moment. "You can go, Ms. Brooks." Natalie went. She made it to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there with her hands at her sides, breathing evenly, staring at the closed doors. The elevator came. She got in. She rode down to the 3rd floor and went to her desk and sat down and opened a vendor compliance report she didn't read a single word of. She texted Elias under the desk. "They know Margaret made contact, moving faster." His reply came in 4 minutes. "Victor called. He's ready." But Victor Alade had spent the previous weekend making a second copy of the encrypted drive. He'd driven 3 hours to deliver one copy to a former colleague in Greensboro, someone outside the company, outside the industry, someone who had no connection to Titan Axis and who would hold it without knowing what it contained. The other copy he'd kept. He and Natalie met at the coffee shop on Glendale for what felt like the third time, but was actually the fifth, because they'd fallen into a pattern of early Thursday mornings that had become its own kind of routine. She'd started ordering the same coffee every time, which she hadn't meant to do, but which felt like the right thing in a situation where very little else was predictable. "I'm ready to provide formal documentation," he said. "Whatever that means legally. Affidavit, deposition, whatever the right mechanism is. I talked to a lawyer." "Your own attorney?" "My brother-in-law. He's a real estate attorney, which doesn't exactly apply, but he helped me understand what whistleblower protections exist and what they require." Victor turned his coffee cup. "He told me the protections are real, but they only kick in if the process is handled right. If I just hand the drive to someone, I'm exposed. If it's part of a formal legal action with the right structure, I'm covered." "Margaret's already thinking about the right structure," Natalie said. "We need to file something that triggers the legal process before we trigger the licensing clause. The sequence matters. If Elias activates the emergency shutdown first, it looks like retaliation or disruption. If we file first, if there's a formal legal action already in motion when the shutdown happens, then the shutdown is a consequence of documented fraud, not an act of aggression." "How long?" "Days, not weeks." She looked at him. "Victor, I need to ask, the 3 incidents, the workers who were injured, do you have their names anywhere in the raw logs?" He nodded slowly. "Incident codes, employee ID numbers. Not names directly, but the codes map to HR records." "We're not going to subpoena HR records at this stage, but the incident codes and the raw log entries are enough to establish that real people were hurt, that the system defects were known, and that the severity was deliberately misclassified." She paused. "That's what moves regulators, not financial fraud. Financial fraud moves courts, but it moves slowly. Safety violations with documentation move the Occupational Safety Office and the state commerce regulators, and they move fast." Victor was quiet. He looked at the table. "I've thought about those 3 workers a lot," he said. "I don't know them, I've never met them, but I know what happened to them, and I know it was preventable, and I know the company wrote it up as their fault." He shook his head. "That's what actually made me decide. Not the money, not the licensing stuff. Those 3 people." Natalie didn't say anything to that. She just nodded once, which felt like the right amount. Robert Kane delivered his forensic analysis on a Thursday morning, the same Thursday as it happened that Natalie and Victor met at the coffee shop, which created a peculiar doubling effect where she received 2 critical pieces of confirmation within 2 hours of each other. Kane's report was 18 pages and contained the kind of technical language that was dense enough to be unassailable in court. He'd examined the forged signature under multiple analysis methods: ink composition dating, pressure pattern mapping, stroke sequence reconstruction, and his conclusion was unambiguous. The signature on the archived Titan Axis licensing document had not been produced by the same hand as the signature on the original agreement. The pressure distribution was wrong. The stroke initiation points were wrong. And the ink composition, while close, showed chemical markers consistent with a reproduction method rather than original ballpoint application. He'd also found something no one had asked him to look for. "There are 4 documents," Margaret said when she called Natalie. "Kane examined the forgery you found, and he cross-referenced it against 3 other documents that Priya flagged from the public filings, documents that reference the licensing agreement by number and purport to modify its terms. All 4 show the same forgery indicators. All 4 are from the same hand. So someone inside the company forged all 4. The same person forged all 4. Kane's fairly confident it was the same forger based on micropattern consistency. He can't identify who, but the consistency itself is significant. It suggests an organized, deliberate process, not a one-time desperation move." "It was planned from the beginning," Natalie said. "From very early on, yes. The first forgery is dated about 8 months after the original agreement was signed. They decided to eliminate the licensing obligation almost as soon as they understood what it meant." Natalie sat with that for a moment. The image of someone in the early days of Titan Axis's growth, looking at the original contract, understanding what the emergency clause could do, and making a calculated decision to remove it through falsification rather than renegotiation. "Margaret," she said, We need to file. I know. I've had the complaint drafted for 4 days. I was waiting for Kane. File it tomorrow morning. A pause. Are you sure? Once we file, they'll know we're moving. They already know we're moving. Celeste called me into her office yesterday. She knows Margaret made contact with their legal department. The window where we have any informational advantage is closing. Natalie kept her voice steady. File tomorrow, and I need you to coordinate with Elias, but he needs to be ready to activate the licensing clause within 48 hours of the filing. That fast. The complaint triggers it. The shutdown follows the complaint. That's the sequence that protects everyone. Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, not uncertain, but measuring. Natalie, once this starts, it doesn't stop. I know that. And you're still inside the building. I know that too. She told Elias that night. All of it, laid out on the kitchen table like the documents they'd been spreading across it for 2 weeks. She told him about Celeste's office, about Kane's 4 forgeries, about Victor's decision, about the filing going in the next morning. He listened without interrupting, which was not natural for him. He was a man who thought out loud, who processed by talking, and the effort of staying quiet while she spoke was visible in the way he kept his hand still on the table. When she finished, he said, I want to be the one to trigger the clause. You are the one. That was always, I want to do it myself, not through Margaret, not through a legal intermediary. My system, my name on the contract, my hand on the switch. He looked at her. Is that going to be a problem? No, it's your right under the agreement. Margaret will confirm the authentication and legal standing, but the activation is yours to execute. She paused. Do you know how to do it technically, after 9 years? He looked at her with an expression that said the question was slightly absurd. I built the shutdown protocol into the original system architecture. I documented it in case I ever needed to hand it off to someone. I know exactly how to trigger it and exactly what happens when I do. He paused. Every facility enters controlled safety standby. Automated systems go to protected hold. Nothing drops. Nothing loses power abruptly. Nothing creates a hazard for the workers on the floor. Emergency lighting stays on. Evacuation protocols trigger in sequence. The safety components were the ones I was most careful about. How long does the shutdown take? From activation to full standby, about 4 hours. It's gradual and controlled. The facilities will go quiet by dawn if we trigger it at midnight. Then that's when we do it. She looked at him. The filing goes in at 9 in the morning. By the time Titan Access's legal team has read it and understood what it means and gotten Celeste on the phone, it'll be afternoon. We trigger at midnight. By the time they have any legal basis to challenge the shutdown, the facilities will already be in standby and the regulators will already be notified. Elias was quiet for a moment. Nat, he said. Yeah. Are you okay? She thought about that honestly, the way she occasionally let herself think about things when she wasn't performing steadiness for someone else's benefit. I'm tired, she said. I'm tired and I'm a little scared and I've been holding a lot of things together at the same time for 2 weeks. She looked at him. But I'm okay. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hands were larger than hers and slightly rough from years of working with physical prototypes and test equipment. And the weight of it was a specific comfort that she couldn't have described to anyone who didn't already understand it. Okay, he said. The complaint was filed at 9:04 the next morning. Margaret called Natalie at 9:07 to confirm. Natalie was sitting at her desk on the 3rd floor of Titan Access Corporation, looking at a vendor compliance report, and she said, "Thank you," in the tone of someone receiving routine information, and hung up. At 10:15, she heard raised voices from the direction of the executive elevator. Not words, just volume. The particular swell of sound that moves through a building when something is wrong at the top of it. At 10:43, Gerald Fitch came to her desk with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the managed neutrality of before. Something closer to alarm running underneath a very thin layer of professional composure. The executive team is in an emergency session, he said. All compliance staff are being asked to refrain from accessing external systems until further notice. What kind of emergency? I'm not in a position to say. Just stay at your desk and focus on internal tasks. He left before she could respond. Dana appeared around the corner approximately 90 seconds later. She sat down in the chair across from Natalie's desk that wasn't meant to be a visitor's chair, but had become one by default. "There are lawyers in the building," Dana said quietly. "I saw 3 people come through the lobby with briefcases. They went straight to the 7th floor." Titan Access's own lawyers? "I don't think so. They didn't go to the legal department. They went straight to 7. External counsel. Celeste had called in external counsel within the hour, which meant the complaint had landed the way a complaint lands when the people it names are already aware they've been building towards something like this. "Dana," Natalie said, "I need you to do something for me." Dana looked at her steadily. "Okay. I need you to send yourself copies of every compliance report you've signed off on in the last 14 months. Personal email, off-network. Don't send anything you didn't generate yourself." She paused. "And I need you to do it in the next hour." Dana studied her. "How much trouble is coming?" "I don't know exactly, but the kind that tends to look for documentation it can use, and documentation it can claim was lost." Dana nodded once. She stood up and went back to her desk, and Natalie heard her keyboard start. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Natalie received a notification on her work computer that her employment was suspended pending review of a potential conflict of interest. The notification came from HR and was copied to Gerald Fitch and to a name she didn't recognize in the legal department, which meant external counsel was already inside the systems. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to her personal email, saved a copy to her personal drive via the browser she'd been using on her own phone rather than the company network, and shut her work computer down with the deliberate finality of someone who doesn't plan to open it again. She gathered her bag. She took one slow look around the cubicle, the printer by the window, Dana's empty chair, the compliance handbook she'd been issued on day 1 still sitting on the corner of the desk. She left the handbook where it was. In the lobby, the security guard who'd printed her badge on the first morning was at the desk. He looked at her as she came through, and she handed over the badge without being asked, and he took it and said nothing, and she walked through the bronze-tinted doors into the afternoon light. She called Elias from the parking lot. "They suspended me," she said. "I know. Margaret just got a cease and desist letter from their external counsel. They're claiming the complaint is based on improperly obtained confidential information." "It's not." "I know it's not. Margaret's already drafting the response." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm out of the building. I'm fine." She unlocked her car and got in and sat there for a second with the door open, the way she had on the first morning, different feeling this time. "Elias, call Victor. He needs to know the filing's been served and the cease and desist has come in. He needs to be prepared for the company to start looking at internal records." "Already did. He's going to his brother-in-law tonight." "Good." She closed the car door. "And you? Are you ready?" "I've been ready for 9 years, he said. "I just didn't know it." Well, they didn't sleep much that night. Not for dramatic reasons, or not only dramatic reasons. Mostly it was the practical reality of 2 people running through logistics and contingencies in the hours before something large and irreversible. Elias was at his computer in the office until 11:30, running diagnostics on the activation sequence, confirming the technical pathway still worked after years of dormancy in the code. Natalie was on the phone with Margaret until 11, working through the regulatory notification sequence. Which agencies, in what order, with what documentation attached. The Occupational Safety Enforcement Division of the State Labor Department needed to be notified first, because the safety violations were the most time-sensitive element. Margaret had prepared the notification package herself, with Victor's raw log data and Kane's forensic report attached. State commerce regulators were second. The Federal Licensing Authority was third. At 11:45, they sat at the kitchen table. Elias had his laptop open to the diagnostic interface. Natalie had her phone with Margaret on standby. The house was quiet around them, the way houses get late at night when the traffic outside has died down and the neighbor's dog has gone in for the evening and there's nothing left making noise except the refrigerator humming and whatever's going on in the heads of the people inside. "You're sure about the safety standby?" Natalie said. It wasn't quite a question. Every automated lift goes to zero load hold, every conveyor locks its safe position. The system broadcasts the standby signal to floor management terminals. There will be supervisors on overnight shift who see the alert and initiate the standard evacuation protocol. No one gets hurt. He looked at her. That was always the most important part. I built the shutdown to be safe specifically because I knew the reason someone would ever use it would be a situation where things had already gone wrong enough that I couldn't trust the other side to prioritize safety. You planned for them, she said, before you even knew who they were. He looked at that thought for a moment. I planned for the possibility of someone like them, he said. Yeah. She looked at the clock on the microwave, 11:58. Margaret's ready, she said. Okay. The notifications go out at 12:01, 1 minute after activation, so there's a timestamp sequence that's unambiguous. Understood. 11:59. Elias looked at the screen. His hands were on the keyboard. He wasn't moving yet. Hey, Natalie said. He looked at her. This is right, she said. What we're doing is right. He nodded. Not the quick nod of agreement, the slow kind. The kind that means the person has thought about it from multiple angles and arrived at the same place each time. The microwave clock turned to midnight. He typed the activation sequence. 11 characters, a specific combination he'd written into the original code 11 years ago and hadn't used since. He pressed enter. For a moment, nothing visible happened. Then a status window opened on the screen, green text on dark background, and began cycling through facility codes in sequence, the identifiers for each of the 15 warehouse locations across 7 states. Beside each code, a status marker shifted from operational to standby initiating. The sequence ran in silence, just the soft click of the keys in the refrigerator and the two of them watching green text on a dark screen. By 12:04, all 15 facilities were in standby initiation. By 12:17, the first 3 had completed transition to protected standby. By 1:13 in the morning, the last facility, a distribution center in eastern Tennessee, completed the cycle. System status, full controlled standby. All facilities. Safety protocols active. Elias sat back. Natalie had sent the notifications at 12:01, as planned. Margaret had her own copies. Victor's documentation was already in the hands of the Labor Department's Enforcement Division through a separate channel his brother-in-law had arranged. It was done, not finished. None of it was finished. The hard parts were still ahead in the weeks and months that would follow. But the moment they'd been building toward for 2 weeks was done, and there was nothing Celeste Hawthorne or her external counsel or her board of directors could do in the next several hours that would undo it. It worked, Elias said. His voice was flat in the way voices go when emotion is present but not performing. Natalie looked at the screen. All 15 facility codes sitting in standby. The warehouse is quiet. The workers safe on the floor following the evacuation protocol that her husband had written into the code years before he knew any of this would happen. Yeah, she said. It worked. She put her hand over his on the desk. Outside, it was just after 1 in the morning, and somewhere in the state of North Carolina, in a glass and steel building with bronze-tinted lobby doors and a logo in brushed aluminum, a phone was ringing in the dark on the 7th floor, and the woman who would answer it was about to find out that the empire she'd spent 9 years building on a foundation she'd stolen had just gone quiet. The call that woke Celeste Hawthorne at 12:43 in the morning came from her head of operations, a man named Dennis Plord, who had been with the company for 7 years and who had never once called her after 10 p.m. The fact that he was calling now, at this hour, in a voice that was working very hard to stay professional and not entirely succeeding, told her everything she needed to know before he finished his first sentence. All 15 facilities are down, he said. Not a power failure. The systems are responsive, they're just locked in some kind of standby protocol I've never seen before. Floor supervisors are reporting orderly evacuation, no injuries, but nothing is moving. No conveyors, no automated lifts, no routing systems. Everything's sitting at protected hold. Celeste was already out of bed. She was the kind of person who slept lightly even in good circumstances, and the last 2 weeks had not been good circumstances. When did it start? 12:01, Eastern Time. All 15 simultaneously. Simultaneously. Not a facility failure, not a regional outage. A coordinated, system-wide event at 1 minute past midnight, which was not how equipment failed. Equipment failed one piece at a time, one location at a time. This was something else. She already knew what it was. She'd known since the complaint landed on her legal team's desk at 9 that morning, since she'd read the filing and seen the specific legal mechanism being invoked and understood, with a clarity she hadn't wanted but couldn't avoid, that Elias Brooks had kept the original contract and that the emergency licensing clause she'd believed neutralized for 9 years was apparently still very much alive. She'd spent the afternoon telling herself it wouldn't hold up, that the forged amendments were clean enough, that the forensic analysis would be contestable, that her legal team could delay the process long enough to find a counter. She'd told herself these things with the practiced conviction of someone who had been successfully managing uncomfortable truths for a very long time. Standing in her bedroom at 12:45 in the morning, listening to Dennis Plord describe 15 silent warehouses, she understood that she had miscalculated the timeline. "Get the tech team on the shutdown interface," she said. "Find out if there's an override pathway." "We tried. There's an authentication lock on every facility system. The override pathway exists, but it requires a credential sequence that our IT team says is encrypted at the source level. They can't break it without the original access key," which Elias Brooks had, which no one at Titan Access had ever had, because no one had ever obtained it legitimately. "Get me Warren Chen," she said. Warren was her lead external counsel, one of the 3 attorneys who had come through the lobby that afternoon. "Get him on the phone, now." "It's almost 1 in the morning, Celeste." "I know what time it is, Dennis." Not. Warren Chen answered on the 4th ring, which meant he'd also been sleeping lightly. She told him what had happened in 2 sentences. He was quiet for a beat. "If the emergency clause is valid," he said, "and if the activation was properly documented and time-stamped, then challenging the shutdown in court is going to require establishing that the clause itself is void, which requires proving the amended agreements are legitimate, which is the same argument we were already losing on the forgery analysis. We haven't lost anything yet. No. But it's 1:15 in the morning and 15 warehouses are offline, and the Labor Department's Enforcement Division received a notification package at 12:01. I know because I just got an email from their duty officer acknowledging receipt." Celeste sat down on the edge of the bed. The room was dark except for the light from her phone screen. What does that mean practically? It means they have grounds for an emergency inspection at every facility. They can be on site by morning if they move fast, and from the sound of it, they've been waiting for documentation to move on this. A pause. "Celeste, I need to ask you something directly, and I need a straight answer." "Ask it." "The safety incident logs, the 3 worker injuries in the last 2 years that are in the filing, are they documented the way the filing describes?" She didn't answer immediately. "Celeste, the incidents were reviewed by our operations safety team," she said. "They were classified as operator error based on the review." "That's not what I asked." Another silence. "Warren." Her voice went quieter. "What I need from you right now is not an interrogation. I need a containment strategy." "I understand that, but I can't build a containment strategy around a factual position I don't understand." He paused. "If those incidents were misclassified and the filing can prove it, then we have a regulatory exposure problem that's separate from and potentially more serious than the licensing question. I need to know what I'm working with." She stood up and walked to the window. The suburb outside was dark and still, the kind of quiet that feels wrong when you're not in a quiet state of mind. "Get the board chair on the phone," she said. "Arrange an emergency session for 7 this morning. I'll speak to you before then." She hung up before he could respond. She stood at the window for a long time. What? The board of Titan Access Corporation consisted of 9 members, of whom 6 were present in the main conference room on the 7th floor at 7:15 that morning, with 2 joining by video. The 9th, a man named Harold Vesey, who had been on the board since the company's founding and who Celeste had always considered reliably in her corner, had sent a message at 6:50 saying he was ill and could not attend. She'd read that message 3 times because she and Harold had spoken on the phone the previous afternoon, and he'd sounded fine, which meant something had changed overnight, and the thing that had changed was what he'd learned about the filing. Warren Chen and a second attorney, a woman named Sandra Birch, who specialized in regulatory defense, sat along one wall. Natalie was not in the room. She was suspended and had been since the previous afternoon. But her work was in the room, spread across the conference table in the form of the legal complaint and its attachments, which Warren had printed and organized with the grim efficiency of a man who understood that the people around this table needed to read the full document before the meeting could mean anything. Celeste sat at the head of the table. She'd slept for approximately 90 minutes and was functioning on that and 2 cups of coffee and the particular kind of adrenaline that kicks in when the thing you've been afraid of for years finally arrives and is, in its way, almost a relief after all the anticipating. She looked around the table. 6 board members plus 2 on screens. Most of them had read the complaint by now. Warren had sent it at 5:30 with a cover note telling them to read it before arriving. The expressions in the room ranged from careful blankness to visible anxiety. James Whitmore, who ran a private equity firm and had been on the board for 4 years, was looking at the table in a way that suggested he'd already begun calculating his personal exposure. "I want to start by addressing the most urgent issue," Celeste said. "The facilities are in controlled standby. No workers have been injured. Operations can potentially be restored through a legal challenge to the shutdown mechanism within..." "Celeste." Board Chair Patricia Lund's voice was measured, but it cut through the room. Patricia was 68, a former operations executive who had joined the board 3 years ago and who Celeste had always found respectfully difficult to manage. "Before we discuss restoration of operations, I think the board needs to understand what we're looking at in this document." "I was getting to that." "I'd like to get to it now." Patricia looked down at the complaint in front of her. Page 7. The forensic analysis of the founding licensing agreement and 3 subsequent amended agreements. The analysis concludes that Mr. Brooks's signature was forged on all 4 documents. She looked up. "Is that analysis correct?" The room went very quiet. Celeste had rehearsed several versions of this moment in her head during the 90 minutes she'd slept and the hours before that when she hadn't. She'd thought about denial, about technical challenges, about pivoting to the question of legal standing. None of those rehearsals had felt right, and standing in front of them now, in the room where she'd sat for 9 years as the person who was always the most prepared and the most composed, she understood with sudden clarity that none of them were going to work. "The agreements as filed in our archive reflect the company's operational understanding of its licensing position," she said. "The authenticity of the specific documents is a matter for legal process." "That's not an answer," said Marcus Dole, who ran the board's audit committee and who Celeste had always considered her most technically demanding member. "The complaint includes a forensic report from a qualified examiner who identifies specific physical markers distinguishing the archived signatures from the original. The report is 18 pages. I read it this morning." He set his copy down. "Did the company forge these documents?" Celeste looked at him. "I need legal counsel before I answer that question," she said. Warren Chen, from his position along the wall, made a small sound that wasn't quite a sigh. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room when the answer to a question has been given by the refusal to give it. Patricia Lund was the one who broke it. "I'd like to hear from Sandra on the regulatory exposure, specifically the worker safety component." Sandra Birch was mid-40s, with the specific kind of composure that comes from spending a career delivering bad news in professional environments. She opened the folder in front of her. The filing includes raw diagnostic data from the WMS engineering server, a backup server that was apparently not decommissioned. The data covers a period of approximately 4 years and shows critical-level system alerts that were not reflected in the official maintenance logs. "The discrepancy is substantial." She paused. 3 specific incidents are identified in which workers sustained injuries. The raw logs show active critical alerts in the automated lift systems at the relevant facilities in the 72 hours preceding each incident. The official incident reports classify all 3 as operator error. The implication being, Patricia said, the implication being that the company had system-level warning of potential equipment failure, and the warnings were not acted on, and the subsequent injuries were classified in a way that obscured the system's role. Sandra closed the folder. The Labor Department's Enforcement Division received the full documentation package at 12:01 this morning. Based on my experience with enforcement timelines, we should expect inspection notices at the affected facilities within 24 to 48 hours. James Whitmore finally looked up from the table. "What's the exposure number?" "For the regulatory piece alone, in the range of 8 to 20 million in penalties, depending on findings. The civil liability exposure for the injured workers, assuming they pursue claims once they're aware of the raw log evidence, which they almost certainly will, is harder to quantify but potentially significant. Sandra paused. That's separate from the licensing damages claim, which the filing values at $4.3 million in unpaid fees and indicates further damages analysis is ongoing. Ongoing, Marcus said. Yes, Priya Sandhu, the financial investigator identified in the filing, has indicated that full internal access would likely produce a substantially larger number. The complaint cites a conservative estimate of 60 to 90 million in value extracted from the unlicensed technology use. Whitmore made a sound, not quite a word. Patricia Lund looked at Celeste. I think we need to recess for 30 minutes, Patricia said. I'd like to speak with legal counsel privately, and then I'd like the board to convene without the executive in attendance. Celeste looked at her. Patricia. Celeste. Patricia's voice was not unkind, which was almost worse than if it had been. Please. Well, she waited in her office. That was the strange part, being asked to wait in her own office while 9 people who worked for the company she'd built decided what to do about her. She sat at her desk and looked out the window at the campus she'd designed and the parking lot where she'd greeted investors and the flat horizon beyond. Philip brought her coffee at 8:15 and set it on the desk without speaking. She noticed he didn't quite meet her eyes, which was different from his usual deference, and told her something about which way he thought this was going. She drank the coffee. She thought about a lot of things, the way you do when you're waiting and there's nothing left to manage or control. She thought about the early days of the company, when the WMS technology had been the thing that separated Titan Axis from every other mid-sized logistics company in the Southeast. She thought about the moment she'd understood what the licensing clause meant and what she'd done about it, which had felt at the time like a practical decision, the kind that companies make when they're scaling fast and the constraints in a founding agreement stop making sense at the new size. She thought about the 3 workers. She'd known about the incident log issue for about 8 months, not through Victor Alade, who she hadn't known was looking at the engineering server, but through a quiet conversation with the head of operations that had ended with a mutual understanding that certain alert categories would be managed at the regional level and not escalated. She'd told herself it was an acceptable risk management approach. She'd told herself the system was stable, that the alerts were conservative, that no one had gotten seriously hurt. 2 of the 3 workers had missed significant time. One had ongoing physical therapy for a shoulder injury. She picked up her coffee and put it down without drinking more of it. At 9:07, Patricia Lund came to her office door. The emergency board session, the one without Celeste, had lasted 48 minutes. Patricia delivered the outcome in 8 sentences, standing in the doorway with the door open behind her, which Celeste understood was deliberate. The board had voted 6-2, with 1 abstention, to remove Celeste Hawthorne as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, pending formal documentation. The 2 dissenting votes had been James Whitmore and a board member named Carl Rubin, both of whom had financial arrangements with the company that made their positions easy to interpret. The abstention was from the board member who had joined by video and who Patricia didn't name. A temporary operations committee would be formed to manage the company during the transition. Warren Chen and Sandra Birch would lead the legal response. The board would be issuing a statement to investors, creditors, and employees by noon. Your employment contract specifies a transition protocol, Patricia said. Warren will be in touch with your personal attorney today. Celeste sat behind her desk. She looked at Patricia and tried to find something to say that was appropriate to the moment, and couldn't. Who's going to run it? She said finally. That's being discussed. The system is still in standby. You need someone who understands the technology. I know. That's also being discussed. Patricia paused. Celeste, for what it's worth, and I understand if it isn't worth much right now, I think you built something real here. Before the rest of it, the company's logistics model, the market position, the team, those are real things. She paused again. The rest of it is going to be what it's going to be. Celeste looked at her for a moment. Is that supposed to be comforting? No, Patricia said honestly. I don't think anything I could say right now would be comforting. I'm just saying what's true. She left. The door stayed open. The board's noon statement landed like the first stone in a pond whose ripples don't stop. By 2 in the afternoon, the 3 primary banking partners who provided Titan Access's revolving credit facilities had each issued formal notices of review, the specific kind of language that means the money isn't gone yet, but the people controlling it are looking for reasons to pull it. By 3:30, 2 of the company's major insurance carriers had notified the board that coverage for operational liability was being reviewed pending the regulatory findings, which was the insurance industry's version of the same message. By 4, 2 of the 5 institutional investors who between them held significant stakes in the company had placed their positions under internal review, which became public through market disclosure requirements and caused the company's private valuation, cited in a funding round 18 months earlier, to be quietly but visibly called into question. Priya Sandhu was watching the financial signals from her home office in Durham. She called Natalie at 4:15. "The credit facilities going under review is the critical one," she said. "Titan Access runs on revolving credit to fund operations between billing cycles. Most logistics companies do. If the banks actually suspend or reduce those lines, the company can't make payroll for the distribution centers within 30 to 60 days, which accelerates everything." Is that likely? The banks are going to want to know if the technology underlying the business model is legally sound. Right now, the answer is that it's in controlled standby under an emergency licensing clause that the company cannot unilaterally override. That's not a bankable position. She paused. The state commerce regulators have already opened a formal investigation based on the notification package. I got a call from their office this afternoon. They want my analysis documents. Margaret coordinated that? Yes, and the Labor Department enforcement team is scheduling facility inspections. They moved faster than Sandra Birch predicted. Notices went out to 3 facilities this afternoon, not tomorrow. Natalie was sitting at the kitchen table when she took this call. Elias was across from her, not on a call but listening to her half of the conversation, reading the shape of it. The laptop was on the table between them, the shutdown status window still open, still showing 15 facilities in protected standby. When she hung up, he looked at her. "The credit lines are going under review," she said. Which means the company is starting to feel the weight of it, not just the legal exposure, the operational reality. They can't run the warehouses without the system. They can't fund operations without the credit. They can't keep the credit without a stable legal foundation. She looked at the laptop screen. And they can't have a stable legal foundation as long as the system is in standby and the licensing clause is in dispute. Which it will be for as long as the forgeries are in dispute. And the forgeries aren't going to survive what Robert Kane's report says about them. He was quiet for a moment. "What's next?" "The board meeting." She looked at him. Natalie presenting the full evidence package. Former executives talking to investigators. The whole picture coming together in one place. She paused. "Margaret called this morning. 2 former Titan Access operations directors have reached out to the investigators voluntarily. They left the company in the past 3 years. They have information about the safety log modifications that goes beyond what Victor's documentation covers." Elias straightened in his chair. "They're coming forward?" "They've been waiting for someone to make the first move. That's often how it works. Someone acts, and then the people who've been sitting on things decide it's safe enough to speak." She paused. "It's never entirely safe, but it's safer once the process is already in motion." He looked at the shutdown status screen again. 15 green indicators, 15 facilities quiet. "I've been thinking about what comes after," he said. "The technology." "Yeah. What happens to it? If the company goes through some kind of restructuring, which seems likely, the system still works. The people in those warehouses still need it to work. The jobs there are real jobs." He ran a hand over his face. "I don't want to burn it down just to prove a point." She looked at him. This was not a new conversation. They'd circled it in the last week, in the spaces between the urgent things. "What do you want?" He'd thought about it. She could tell he'd thought about it carefully. "I want it to be run right, properly licensed, properly maintained, with the diagnostic alerts actually going to the people who need them. I want the workers in those facilities to be safe." He paused. "I don't want to sell it to the highest bidder and wash my hands. I also don't want to operate 15 warehouses. That's not what I do. An independent structure, she said slowly. A licensing organization, something that holds the IP and manages the licensing terms, but isn't a competitor in the logistics space. Something that can require safety compliance as a condition of licensing. Something that has actual teeth. He met her eyes. Is that possible? It's possible. It's not simple, but it's possible. She leaned back in her chair. It's the kind of thing Margaret would know how to structure. At 6 that evening, the board of Titan Access Corporation issued a second statement. This one was addressed to employees, and its language was more careful than the noon statement to investors. More careful, and as a result, more clearly frightened. It acknowledged the CEO transition. It acknowledged ongoing legal proceedings. It stated that the board was committed to resolving the operational situation and that further updates would follow. Dana Cho read it on her phone in her car in the parking lot of a grocery store and then sat there for a few minutes with her hands in her lap. She'd spent the day at her desk on the 3rd floor doing exactly what she'd been told to do, which was nothing external and all internal tasks, while the 7th floor burned in slow motion above her. She'd heard things through the specific kind of building osmosis that carries information whether or not anyone is trying to share it. The removed CEO, the board session, the banking notices, the investigators who had begun calling the general counsel's office before noon. She called Natalie from the parking lot. "Are you okay?" she said when Natalie answered. "I'm okay. Are you?" "I'm sitting in a parking lot trying to decide whether I still have a job tomorrow." She paused. "Do I?" "I can't promise you that. The company's going through a process and I don't control what happens to it. But Dana, the documentation you sent yourself, the compliance reports you signed, those establish what you did and didn't know and when. That matters. I wasn't involved in any of it. I know, and the record will show that." A pause. "You helped me. On day 1, you helped me. And later when Philip was asking questions, you helped me again. You didn't have to do that." Dana was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do that much." "You did enough." Natalie's voice was direct without being effusive. "I won't forget it." Dana sat in the parking lot for another minute after they hung up. Then she got out of the car and went into the grocery store because she still needed things for dinner, and life continued requiring ordinary things even when extraordinary ones were happening. The final board session, the one that would become the formal record of Titan Access Corporation's decisive confrontation with its own history, was convened not on the 7th floor, but in a neutral conference facility 2 miles from campus, which the board's legal team had arranged, because the 7th floor no longer felt like neutral ground to anyone. The date was 6 days after the midnight shutdown. 6 days in which Natalie had not slept more than 5 hours any given night, in which Elias had been on the phone with Margaret and with engineers he trusted about the independent licensing structure, in which Victor Alade had given a formal recorded statement to investigators that was thorough and specific, and that his brother-in-law had reviewed twice. 6 days in which former operations directors had provided their own statements, in which Priya Sandhu had produced a supplemental financial analysis, and in which Warren Chen had run out of legal maneuvers that offered any realistic prospect of changing the fundamental situation. Natalie sat at the witness table beside Margaret. Across from her were 9 board members. Harold Vesey had returned, looking drawn, which told its own story about what he'd decided. And behind them, along the back wall, were the investigators from the State Commerce Office and a representative from the Labor Department Enforcement Division. Celeste Hawthorne was not in the room. She had retained personal criminal defense counsel 2 days earlier, which was a statement of its own. Margaret presented the forensic analysis first. Robert Kane had submitted a formal declaration. Margaret walked through it without theater, methodically, the way she had once told Natalie that the strongest thing you can do with a solid case is resist the temptation to perform it. The forgeries. All 4 documents, the ink composition analysis, the stroke pattern discrepancies, the original agreement with the date-stamped notarization, and the smear below the final stroke that was not reproduced in any of the falsified versions. Then Natalie presented the financial analysis. Priya's work. 19 months of unpaid licensing fees, 9 years of value extraction, The executive bonus in the year the payments stopped. She laid it out without editorializing because the numbers editorialized themselves. Victor Alette's statement was read into the record by a legal representative at Victor's request. He'd chosen not to be present, which his attorney had advised and which was his right. The raw diagnostic logs were entered as a formal exhibit. The 3 incident codes, the critical alerts in the 72 hours before each injury, the official reports classifying all 3 as operator error. When the presentation concluded, the room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when a large body of information has just settled into them and nobody has yet begun the work of processing it. Marcus Dole spoke first. I want it in the record that the audit committee never received the diagnostic discrepancy data. The first I was aware of any divergence between raw logs and archived maintenance records was this document. Noted, said the Commerce Office investigator. Patricia Lund looked at Warren Chen. What's your assessment of the current legal position? Warren had the look of a man who had gone through several stages of this process and arrived at something close to professional resignation. The licensing claim is almost certainly valid. The original agreement is authenticated, the emergency clause is active, the shutdown was properly documented and sequenced after the legal complaint was filed. The forgery analysis is strong enough that I don't see a viable path to invalidating the original agreement in court. He paused. The safety violations expose the company to regulatory penalties and civil liability. And the financial analysis, if it holds under forensic accounting, and I don't have reason to believe it won't, establishes a damages base that is larger than the company's current liquid position. Meaning, Patricia said, meaning that a judgment in favor of the claimants, combined with the regulatory penalties, would exceed what the company can pay without either a restructuring or a liquidation event. He said it carefully and without drama. We are looking at a company that cannot sustain its current structure. James Whitmore had been quiet for most of the session. He looked up now with the expression of a man who had been running numbers in his head for the past hour. If the technology is still functional, if the WMS is intact and operational, is there any pathway to restructuring around the licensing issue? Patricia looked at Margaret. Margaret said, there is a proposed structure being developed. An independent licensing organization that would hold the IP, manage licensing to any qualifying operator under defined safety and compliance terms, and allow the warehousing operations to continue under properly licensed arrangements. The IP owner has expressed a willingness to discuss that framework rather than pursue maximum financial damages. A long silence. Elias Brooks would consider that? Whitmore said. He's already considered it, Margaret said. It's what he proposes. Patricia Lund looked around the table. The board members looked at each other, the way people do when they've arrived at something they didn't come into the room expecting to find. Not quite relief, not quite resolution, but the sense of a door that wasn't there before. We should talk about what that would actually require, Patricia said. Yes, Margaret said. We should. What? Natalie stepped out of the conference room at 11:40 to take a call from Elias, who was at home waiting and had been since 7 that morning. She stood in the corridor outside the room, institutional carpet under her feet, fluorescent lights doing what fluorescent lights do, and told him what had been said and what had not been said, and what the room felt like when Margaret proposed the licensing structure. How did they respond, he asked, like people who just realized there might be a way out of this that isn't total collapse. She paused. It's not settled. Nothing's settled, but they're talking about it, which an hour ago I wasn't sure they would. He was quiet for a moment. Celeste? Not in the room. She has criminal defense counsel now. That's its own process. Right. Another pause. How are you doing? She leaned against the wall. The corridor was empty except for a water dispenser at the far end that was making a faint bubbling sound. Tired, she said. Genuinely bone-deep tired. But I think it's going to hold together. What we built, the sequence, the documentation, the structure of it, I think it holds. It holds, he said. We were careful. You were careful. You built in the shutdown 11 years ago because you were thinking about this possibility before it existed. I was thinking about hypothetical bad actors, which turned out to be real ones. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. Get through the rest of the session, he said. Come home. We'll figure out the next part when you get here. She straightened up off the wall. Through the conference room door, she could hear the low murmur of voices resuming. The board and the investigators, and Margaret beginning the slow, imperfect, necessary work of figuring out what came next. Yeah, she said. I'll be home by tonight. She got home at 7:40 that evening. Elias had left the porch light on, which he always did when she was coming back after dark, a habit from the first apartment they'd shared that had followed them through 2 moves and 8 years of marriage without either of them ever commenting on it. Small continuities. The kind that hold a life together without announcing themselves. She sat in the car for a minute before going in. Not the way she'd sat in the parking lot on her first morning at Titan Axis. That had been anticipation, the particular tension of walking towards something unknown. This was different. This was the sitting still of someone who has been moving hard for a long time and needs one quiet minute before stepping back into the ordinary world that was still there waiting, unchanged, while everything else had been happening. The grass still needed cutting. She noticed that. Same as 3 weeks ago. She went inside. Elias was in the kitchen, and this time he didn't have anything on the stove. He was just sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold, looking at nothing in particular, and when she came through the door, he looked at her in a way that asked the question without needing words. It's moving, she said. It's going to take time, but it's moving in the right direction. He nodded slowly. Sit down. She sat. He got up and poured her coffee without asking if she wanted any, because he knew she did. And he put it in front of her and sat back down, and they were quiet for a moment in the way they'd learned to be quiet together, not avoiding something, just letting it settle before they picked it up again. Margaret called while you were driving, he said. I know, I saw it. I'll call her back tonight. She said the board is formally engaging on the licensing structure proposal. They want a term sheet by end of next week. Natalie wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. That's faster than I expected. They don't have a lot of other options. The credit lines are still under review. The regulators are at 3 facilities, and the forensic accountants that the Commerce Office brought in started pulling internal records this afternoon. He paused. Priya called too. She said the internal records are going to produce a number significantly larger than 90 million. She looked at the table. How significantly? Priya said conservatively 120, possibly higher. The number sat there between them. Not abstract anymore, not a conservative estimate from public filings, but a real number derived from real internal records, the full accounting of 9 years of extracted value from work that Elias had done and been robbed of. What do you want to do with that number? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about it all day. He set his coffee down. The 3 workers. Victor's documentation. Their injury claims. Whatever they've been carrying, but medical costs, lost wages, the fact that they were told it was their fault. He looked at her. That should be the first thing. Before any licensing structure, before any settlement framework, those 3 people should have their situations addressed. Directly. She held his gaze. Margaret can build that into the settlement terms. A priority compensation fund independently administered before any other financial disposition. That's what I want. Okay. She set her cup down. What else? He leaned back in his chair. He had the look of someone who has been building something in his head for days and is now seeing whether it holds up when spoken aloud. The licensing organization. I don't want it to be about revenue. I want it to cover costs, maintain the infrastructure, fund the safety compliance monitoring, but I don't want to be sitting somewhere collecting licensing checks on technology that's running warehouses I've never seen. He paused. I want the safety clause to be non-negotiable. Any operator who wants to license the system has to accept real-time diagnostic monitoring and a defined response protocol for critical alerts. Not suggestions. Requirements with teeth. You'd have to staff that. Monitoring requires people. I know. I've been thinking about who. She waited. Victor Alade, he said. He found the raw data in the first place. He understands the diagnostic layer. He spent 14 months auditing a company that was hiding things from him, which means he knows exactly what hiding looks like. He paused. If he's willing. Natalie thought about Victor in the coffee shop on Glendale, turning his cup in his hands, talking about his daughter starting college, talking about the three workers he'd never met but couldn't stop thinking about. "He might be," she said. "You'd have to ask him." "I'll ask him." They sat for a little while longer. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had been for the last 3 weeks. Same table, same slightly uneven chair leg on her side, same clock on the microwave that ran 2 minutes fast. All of it unchanged while the thing they'd been building toward had built and crested and broken over something very large and was now receding into the slower work of consequence and repair. "I need to tell you something," Elias said. She looked at him. "When I found the original contract that night, when we sat here and I read the forged document and understood what had been happening, my first feeling wasn't anger." He looked at his hands on the table. "It was shame, which doesn't make sense, I know. They stole from me. But I felt ashamed that I hadn't known, that I'd let the licensing fees go, that I'd told Margaret to drop it, that I'd just moved on, built other things, let them have it." He paused. "I kept thinking that I should have known, that I should have paid more attention." She was quiet for a moment. "You trusted a contract." "I trusted a contract and didn't follow up when it stopped being honored. That's on me." "Elias, you had a house and a mortgage and a career and a life. You made a practical decision not to fight over a billing dispute with a company that was bigger than you. That's not a character flaw. That's just what people do when they're trying to live." She met his eyes. "They used your trust against you. That's not shame. That's something that was done to you." He didn't immediately agree, which she didn't expect him to. He turned it over the way he turned everything over, looking at it from multiple angles, checking it for structural soundness. After a moment, he nodded, the slow kind. "I still wish I'd known sooner," he said. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." The weeks that followed were not triumphant. That was the honest truth of it, the part that doesn't make it into the version of events that gets summarized and retold. The process of consequence is slower and more grinding than the moment of confrontation, and the moment of confrontation itself. Midnight, the laptop, 15 green indicators going to standby, had already begun to feel, in the way that intense things do, more like a memory than a lived experience. The State Labor Department's Enforcement Division completed its inspections of all 3 affected facilities within 2 weeks. The findings confirmed what Victor's raw logs had shown: critical level alerts that had been systematically downgraded in the official maintenance records, a pattern of misclassification that the investigators characterized as deliberate rather than administrative. The penalty assessments came in at $11.4 million across the 3 facilities, which was toward the middle of Sandra Birch's projected range, and which the company, without its CEO and with its credit facilities still under review, had no immediate capacity to pay. The 3 injured workers were identified through the incident codes in Victor's documentation. Their names were Marcus Webb, a lift operator in a Tennessee distribution center, Suyon Park, a floor supervisor in a Virginia facility, and a man named Robert Delgado in a North Carolina warehouse who had been out of work for 4 months with a shoulder injury and who had spent those months believing, because that was what the official incident report said, that he had done something wrong. Margaret's office contacted their attorneys directly. Natalie didn't attend those meetings and didn't ask for details because it wasn't her place. But she heard from Margaret that Delgado's attorney had called back within an hour of the initial contact and that there had been a long silence on the phone when the attorney finished explaining what the raw diagnostic logs showed about the lift system's alert status in the 72 hours before Delgado's injury. "What kind of silence?" Natalie had asked. "The kind where someone is trying to hold themselves together," Margaret said. "He'd been blaming himself for 4 months. Natalie had to set the phone down for a minute after that. The Priority Compensation Fund was the first formal element of the settlement structure to be agreed upon. Elias had insisted on it, and the board, in the new posture of a company trying to demonstrate it, understood the gravity of what had happened under its previous leadership, had not resisted. The fund was independently administered by a neutral trustee, separately from all other settlement proceedings, with each of the 3 workers receiving full medical cost coverage, lost wage compensation, and a separate damages payment whose terms were confidential but which Margaret described as appropriate. Appropriate was the word she used. Not generous, not adequate. Appropriate. The specific professional language that meant the number reflected what had actually been taken from these people and made a genuine attempt to address it, without being able to fully address it, because some things can't be fully addressed, only honestly reckoned with. Celeste Hawthorne was indicted on 6 counts 8 weeks after the midnight shutdown: wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy to commit document fraud, and 3 counts related to the concealment of workplace safety violations. Warren Chen was not her defense attorney. She had her own, a specialist in white-collar criminal defense from a firm in Washington who had handled cases like this before, and who, according to the legal reporting that Natalie made a point of not reading obsessively but occasionally did, was likely to pursue a strategy centered on the argument that Celeste had relied on the advice of counsel and hadn't personally directed the forgeries. That argument had a limited horizon, given that the board resolution authorizing the performance bonus in the year the licensing payments stopped bore her signature, and given that 2 former operations executives had provided statements describing conversations with her directly about the diagnostic log classifications. But the argument would buy time, which was often the realistic goal in cases of this complexity. Natalie knew all this and tried to hold it at a certain distance, not because she didn't care how it resolved, she did, but because she'd learned over 11 years of legal work that waiting for criminal proceedings to deliver a specific emotional satisfaction was a reliable way to end up disappointed. The system moved at its own pace and produced its own outcomes, and the outcomes were rarely as clean as the story demanded. What she cared about was that the process was real, that the documentation was in the hands of people with the authority to do something with it, that the workers who'd been hurt had been reached, that the system Elias built was not going to keep running in the dark, under forged agreements, with its safety alerts suppressed. The rest was someone else's process now. Victor Alade said yes. He said it in the same coffee shop on Glendale at the same corner table on a Thursday morning in early November, which was by then several weeks after the last crisis meeting and several weeks before the licensing structure would be formally incorporated. Elias was there this time. He and Victor had talked twice on the phone before this meeting, but sitting across from each other in person was different, and both of them knew it. Elias had laid out the role honestly, without overselling it. Director of Safety Compliance and Diagnostic Oversight for the independent licensing organization, which would be called the Brooks Infrastructure Trust, a name Natalie had suggested and that Elias had agreed to with some discomfort, because it sounded more permanent and more significant than he was entirely comfortable with, but which Margaret had argued was the right kind of signal to send about the organization's independence and accountability. The role was real work, not a title. Monitoring diagnostic feeds from licensed facilities, overseeing the alert response protocols, conducting quarterly reviews, flagging non-compliance. The kind of work that needed someone who understood both the technical layer and the human consequences of ignoring what the technical layer was saying. It's not going to be a comfortable job, Elias told him. You're going to be the person who tells operators when they're failing their own safety requirements. Some of them are going to resent it. I know what that feels like, Victor said. I know you do. That's why I'm asking you. Victor looked at his coffee. He had the same quality Natalie had noticed in the first meeting, that inward steadiness that came from years of watching and not speaking, and the particular weight that comes from having finally spoken. My daughter starts college in January, he said. The timing is... He stopped. The timing is actually fine. It's fine. He looked at Elias. What happens if I find something and the operator pushes back? The licensing agreement has a compliance enforcement clause. I built it in specifically. If a licensee fails to address a flagged safety issue within a defined response window, we can suspend their license. Not permanently. It's graduated. First flag is a notice and a response plan. Second flag is operational review. Third is suspension until resolved. He paused. And I'll back you every time. That's not a promise I'm making to sound good. It's a structural commitment. Victor studied him for a moment. You built the shutdown protocol before you knew you'd need it. You built the safety clause before you knew Titan Axis would ignore it. He paused. You think ahead. I try to. I don't always get it right. Nobody does. Victor looked out the window at the street for a moment. Yes, he said. I'll take the role. They shook hands across the corner table, which felt a little formal and a little necessary at the same time. Dana Cho was not the person who got credit for anything, which Natalie thought about sometimes. How the story, when it was later summarized in the state commerce regulator's public findings and in the legal reporting that covered the case, had no real room for someone like Dana. Someone who had said, "Be careful," and I left at 5 and didn't see anything, and the printer by the window doesn't jam. The small protections, the things that don't show up in a complaint or a forensic report, but that made the space around the harder things possible. Natalie called her the week before Thanksgiving. I wanted you to know, she said, that when the trust is operational and doing its first round of operational hires, there's a compliance oversight position that would be open to external candidates. Dana was quiet for a moment. Are you offering me a job? I'm telling you a position exists. Applying for it would be your decision. Another pause. What happened to my current job? Titan Axis's operations division is being restructured under new management. Your department is apparently being kept intact during the transition. You probably know more about that than I do. I know about as much as anyone does, which is not very much. A pause. Can I think about it? Of course. Natalie, Dana's voice shifted slightly. Is the new organization, is it going to be real? Not just a framework that looks good on paper. Natalie thought about that for a second. The honest answer. I think so. I think Elias is the kind of person who builds things that work because he can't make himself build them any other way. Whether the organization around the work stays real over time, that's harder to promise. Organizations drift. People get comfortable. Things that were supposed to have teeth lose them. She paused. That's why we need people like Victor watching the technical side and people like you watching the compliance side. The structure only works if the people in it actually give a damn. Another silence. Okay, Dana said. I'll think about it. She did apply, eventually. Not immediately. She took her time, which Natalie respected. The position was competitive, and Dana went through the same process as every other candidate, which had been a condition Natalie set for herself before the trust was even incorporated. She hadn't told Elias she'd called Dana. She'd told him only that a strong candidate had applied for the compliance position, and he'd reviewed the application without knowing the connection, and he'd said she looked very qualified, and Natalie had said yes, she does. Dana got the job on her own record. That was important. Not just symbolically, actually important, in the way that matters for the long term, because an organization built on genuine merit is sturdier than one built on loyalty, and Natalie had been in enough professional environments to know the difference between the two. The Brooks Infrastructure Trust was formally incorporated in December, 5 months after Natalie's first morning in the Titan Axis parking lot. The articles of incorporation were 43 pages, which Margaret considered streamlined given the complexity of what they were establishing. The founding documents included the original licensing agreement, authenticated, date-stamped, the real signature with its real smear below the final stroke, as an exhibit, not for legal necessity but because Elias had asked for it. It's the beginning of the thing, he said when Margaret asked why. It should be in the founding record. The trust's first licensee was the restructured Titan Axis Operations Division, operating under new management that the board had installed after a search that took 6 weeks and produced someone named Catherine Yee, who had spent 15 years running distribution networks for a company that had an imperfect but genuine record on worker safety. Patricia Lund had sent the candidate to Margaret's attention, which was one of those small acts of good faith that don't erase what came before but represent something real on their own terms. Catherine Yee had read the full case file before her first board meeting and had asked, as her first question, to speak directly with Victor Alade about the diagnostic monitoring protocols, which told Elias what he needed to know. The warehouses came back online in stages, beginning in the 3rd week of December. Not all at once, facility by facility, as each one completed a compliance review and a safety systems audit that Victor conducted personally. It took 11 days to bring all 15 facilities back to operational status. There were delays, There were arguments with regional operations managers who found the new requirements burdensome. There was one facility where the initial audit found 2 alert categories that had been improperly configured in the local system and needed remediation before the license was activated. Victor sent Elias a detailed report on each facility. Elias read every one of them. Mpus. On the day the last warehouse came back online, Natalie went for a long walk in the neighborhood after dinner, which was something she did occasionally when she needed to move and think at the same time. It was cold in the way that December evenings are cold in North Carolina. Not brutal, but definite, with a damp in the air that gets into your coat collar. She walked for about 40 minutes without destination, which took her past the park 2 blocks over and the elementary school and the coffee shop that she and Elias had their first date near 11 years ago, before it changed ownership and then changed ownership again, and was now something else entirely, though the building was the same. She thought about Celeste Hawthorne. She didn't do this often, and when she did, it wasn't with the satisfaction she might have expected. What she felt was something more complicated. The recognition that Celeste had been genuinely capable, that she had built something real in the years when she was building it legitimately, and that the decision to steal rather than renegotiate had been a choice, a real and considered choice, and that the consequences of it were both just and in some ways tragic, in the way that all avoidable things are tragic. The waste of it. The specific waste of someone talented choosing the shorter, darker path because it was faster. She didn't feel sorry for Celeste, but she didn't feel the specific sharp satisfaction of an enemy defeated either. She felt more like someone who had watched a structural failure happen in slow motion, the kind where you can see, in retrospect, exactly where the load-bearing element gave way, and you understand how it happened. And understanding it doesn't make you feel good. When she got back to the house, Elias was on the back porch in a jacket that wasn't quite warm enough for the temperature, looking up at the sky in the way he sometimes did when he was thinking about something that didn't have an obvious solution. Victor sent the last facility report, he said without turning around. I know, I got the notification. All 15 back online, so full safety compliance certification on everyone. He paused. Takes 11 days to do it right. She stood beside him on the porch. The yard was dark except for the spillover from the neighbor's light, and the grass was dead in the way winter grass is dead. Not gone, just dormant, waiting. How do you feel? She asked. He thought about it. Not a quick answer, a real one. Like I finished something, he said. Not like I won something, more like I finished a piece of work I'd been leaving undone for a long time without knowing it. He looked at her. Does that make sense? Yes. I thought about what it would feel like for years. Not the Titan Axis thing specifically, just the general shape of it, being taken advantage of and having no way to respond. I thought it would feel like victory when it ended. He shook his head slightly. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like the work is done and the thing is right now, and I can move on to something else. She leaned against the porch railing beside him. What's the something else? He had an answer for that, which she'd half expected. Elias always had a next thing. There are 3 other companies using infrastructure I built in contract work between 2012 and 2016. I'm going to go through the original agreements with Margaret. Not because I think they're all doing what Titan Axis did. I don't. But because I should know. I should actually know what's in those agreements and whether the terms are being honored. He paused. I should have known the first time. You knew. You just didn't follow up. Yeah, I'm going to follow up now. She nodded. That was the thing about Elias. He didn't dramatize his regrets or weaponize them against himself. He just made them into action items and put them on a list and worked through the list. She'd married him partly for that quality, though she hadn't known to name it at the time. I need to tell you something, she said. He looked at her. I've been thinking about what I want to do next, work-wise. She looked out at the dark yard. I've been offered a position with the Trust's Legal Oversight Panel. Margaret proposed it. I'd be one of 3 attorneys reviewing licensing compliance disputes. She paused. I turned it down. He was quiet. Not because it's not good work. It's good work. But I've been inside this thing for 5 months, deeply inside it. And I need to be outside it for a while. I need to do something where I'm not connected to every person in the room by history. She paused. There's a nonprofit legal clinic in Raleigh that does employment law for workers, wage theft cases, wrongful classification, workplace safety violations. They have a part-time opening. Part-time. Part-time while I figure out what I actually want to do long-term. I've been in compliance and litigation my whole career and I'm good at it, but I've been doing it for the wrong reasons sometimes. Security reasons, practical reasons. She finally looked at him. I want to do it for better reasons for a while and see what that feels like. He held her gaze. That's going to pay significantly less than anything else you've described. I know. Okay. He said it without hesitation, without the layered pause of someone doing financial calculations in their head. Just okay. What about the trust position? Was Margaret upset? Margaret is never upset. She said she respected the decision and she'd keep the panel position open for 6 months in case I changed my mind. Will you change your mind? Probably not, but it's good to know the door's there. He nodded. The neighbor's light on the other side of the fence shifted. Someone going through a room, and for a moment the yard was slightly brighter, then settled back. We should go in, Elias said. It's cold. I know. In a minute. They stood there for another minute, not talking, not needing to, the kind of quiet that has texture to it, not empty, but full of the particular weight of things that have been said, and things that have been done, and things that are over, and things that are beginning. The grass was going to need cutting in spring. She thought about that and almost said it out loud. The small joke of it, the continuity, the way life kept requiring ordinary things. But she didn't, because some things are better as private thoughts. The small ones. The ones that are only funny if you've been carrying them through something hard and come out the other side and can finally look at them again. Okay, she said. Let's go in. There's a particular thing that happens when someone finally tells the truth about a wrong that's been running long enough to seem like the normal state of things. The truth doesn't immediately fix everything it touches. That's not how truth works, and anyone who tells you differently is selling the cleaner version of the story. What it does is stop the running. It interrupts the mechanism. It makes the thing visible enough that the people whose job is to address it can actually do their job. Elias Brooks never intended to be the person who took down a billion-dollar company. He intended to be the person who built something good and got paid for it and moved on to the next project. The fact that he became the former had less to do with any particular courage or strategy on his part than with the fact that he'd been careful. Careful when he built the original contract, careful when he kept every document, careful when he drafted the emergency clause at the suggestion of an attorney who understood what load-bearing technology becomes to the companies that depend on it. The care came before the crisis. That was the part that mattered. Natalie never intended to be a whistleblower. She'd taken the job at Titan Access because it was stable and paid well, and she and Elias needed what stable and paid well provides. She walked into the compliance archive looking at onboarding materials and recognized a signature she'd watched go onto documents for 8 years, and she made the decision, in the stairwell between floors with a bruise forming on her wrist, to keep the document in her bag and find out what it meant. That decision was made in about 4 seconds and changed the shape of the next year of her life, and she would make the same decision again. Victor Alade sat on a secret for 8 months because he had a daughter and a mortgage and a career he'd built carefully over a long time. The fact that he eventually picked up an encrypted drive and drove it 3 hours to a colleague in Greensboro was not an act of heroism in the movie sense. No dramatic music, no single moment of decisive choice. It was the accumulation of 8 months of not sleeping well and thinking about 3 workers he'd never met, until one day the weight of it tipped over the weight of the other things, and he made the call. That's usually how it works. Not a moment, but a gradual unbearability. Dana Cho got a job on her own record and was good at it. The 3 injured workers had their situations addressed. Not fixed. You don't fix a 4-month shoulder injury that was blamed on the person it happened to. Not entirely, not with a settlement check, but addressed. Robert Delgado's attorney called Margaret's office back the day after Margaret's initial contact, and in that call, the thing that mattered most happened, which was not the beginning of financial negotiation, but something simpler. Someone telling him that it wasn't his fault, that the system flagged a critical alert 72 hours before he was hurt, that the company knew and didn't act and then wrote it up wrong, that he hadn't done anything wrong, He'd been carrying that for 4 months. The correction didn't take 4 months. It took one phone call. The Brooks Infrastructure Trust went into its second year with 11 licensed operators across 4 states, a compliance panel that was producing its first policy frameworks, and Victor Alade running safety monitoring with the specific combination of technical knowledge and institutional skepticism that the job required. He was harder on non-compliance than anyone had expected, including Elias, which turned out to be exactly right. Celeste Hawthorne's trial was scheduled for the following spring. Natalie followed it in the news with the professional attention of someone who understood what the proceedings would involve and the human attention of someone who had been in a stairwell at the receiving end of a decision Celeste had made. She didn't wish Celeste additional suffering. She wished her a fair process and a just outcome, which were the same things she'd want for anyone, and which were also, as it happened, the things most likely to produce accountability. The grass got cut in April. Elias did it while Natalie was at the legal clinic, which was the kind of practical solidarity that doesn't get noticed until you're home and the yard looks right and you realize someone took care of something without announcing it. She noticed. That was the year, and those were the people. And the story ended not with everything resolved perfectly, but with the important things pointed in the right direction, which is the best that most true endings actually offer, if you're honest about it, and which is enough.